All right, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to the live stream today. I'm here with a couple guests in Discord. If you want to join, make sure you follow the link in the description. What's going on, everybody? We've got Swishy and Ulfric and a couple other people that are new to the stream. So if you guys want to introduce yourself or say anything. Quite generic. So just a couple things before we jump into the discussion. This is more of just some updates. So the first book club ended. If you haven't seen the analysis or discussion of the Leviathan, go check it out. And for this month, we're going to be doing 2 books. Let me bring up my list here. First book is going to be Machiavelli's The Prince, and the second book is going to be Huxley's Brave New World. So they're relatively short books, nothing serious. And then I'll do one video halfway through the month on one of them, and then the other video will be at the end of the month for the other. So now that that's out of the way, what are we going to talk about today, guys? First topic, anyone? Swishy? Yeah. And what is your ideal monarchy? What does it look like? Let's say tomorrow you had full reign over a certain country. What would your monarchism look like?
You'd have the king chosen by God. So you'd also have it as hereditary as well, so it gets passed on to the next generation. It'd be absolute monarchy, none of this democratic monarchy or anything like that.
Now,
And
would it be divine right? The Christian
yeah,
base?
divine right. Yeah. Right of kings.
Gotcha.
So that way, I would say the fact that I think Christian values are disappearing is part of the problem with the West. I think it's part of the reason why our culture is disappearing. I think it would benefit the monarchy. Basically, you have something like fascism, which is absolute power. Then you have hereditary fascism, which takes it a step further, which is absolute power for you and your entire generation. Monarchy takes that in a different direction and adds Christian values.
Gotcha.
So that's why I think it's a better version.
Now, in your version of this divine right Christian monarchy, would you take the divine legislator position, or would you take the divine protector legislature? I don't know if you know the difference between the two, but
no, I don't. Can you explain them to me?
Sure. Okay, so there in the divine right monarchies, there's many different types of how it's kind of up to the ruler how he sees himself as a representative of God. But the two main ones, and I think the two best ones, excuse me, you have the original Germanic kind, which goes way back to the 8th, 9th century, where essentially their monarchies saw themselves as protectors of the divine law, which essentially means the king cannot legislate anything that is not legislated already by God or by the scripture. So if it's allowed in whatever holy text that they're using, the king can do it. But in divine right legislating, the king can legislate in any way that he sees fit, because he is the representation of God on the earth, which gives him the divine right to do whatever he wants. So
divine right legislating would be the route I would go down. I don't think you should be held back by your Bible, because it's all down to interpretation. And it's kind of a ridiculous thing to base a lot off of.
Right. Now, also within, it's not just the Bible per se. It was also the clergy. So the old,
even more dangerous.
Yeah, I know. But just so everyone's aware, the old style monarchies, the very oldest style, they would be very closely connected to the church, especially whatever the local congregation would be, and they would take inspiration from the clergymen, and in particular from the Pope. So the Pope would kind of decree some of the things that the monarchies could do, depending on how close the relationship was. But what type of Christianity would you prefer in this divine right system?
Ideally, something similar to Anglican Protestantism.
Really? You wouldn't take the
Yeah.
old Catholic approach?
No, no, no. I don't like Catholicism.
What to you is the biggest difference between Catholicism and Protestantism? What makes it
Forgiveness.
forgiveness? Okay, and what exactly does that mean?
The whole, you ever heard the Al Pacino phrase? The quote, I prayed for a bike, but I knew God didn't work like that, so I stole a bike and prayed for forgiveness.
Okay, okay.
Catholics can do that. Catholics can go to the priest, they can beg for forgiveness, and they can be absolved of their sins.
Right. So
Protestants don't get that.
you take the Martin Luther approach, which is basically you can't pay for forgiveness or anything like that.
Somewhat. I don't agree with everything on Luther, though.
Well, sure,
I don't,
sure.
Yeah, but yeah, I get that part.
Right, right. And how would you establish this monarchy? Like, let's say in today's society, is there a practical vision you have for establishing a monarchy?
Honestly, it's pretty much impossible. I haven't thought of any logical way to do it. It's because my ideal monarchy system would require a bloodline of Scottish kings, which goes back a long line, and those were cut off. The English murdered them, so that doesn't really exist anymore. So you'd have
Right.
to establish a monarchy from scratch, which is really, really hard to do, like really difficult to do. You'd require the support of the people. You would require the people to already be extremely religious. You would require a massive shift in power towards your direction before any of this was even possible to establish a monarchy.
Now, have you thought about using something like fascism in order to eventually establish a monarchy? Like fascism as
Yeah,
a goal and then monarchy as an abstract kind of in the future goal?
yeah, yeah. For me, hereditary fascism is the most practical form I can go head towards at the moment, which would if you look at places like North Korea, they already established somewhat of a worship and a kingship almost
Not
of
not
these
not sure if
hereditary
you want to
fascist
use like
leaders.
North Korea as a good example, but I get what you're
Well,
saying.
just for the way that the people look upon the leader, there's this mystique about them. He's not just a politician, or he's almost like a king, right?
Yeah, well,
So
in North Korea,
that
it's
sort
more
of
of like a
mystique that builds up.
yeah, it's more of like a literal god feeling. But yeah, yeah, I get you.
Yeah, obviously it's a pretty fucked up version, but that feeling does come about through hereditary fascism. So I think it could be possible to go from hereditary fascism, go through maybe 3 or 4 generations, and already people respect that bloodline as the future leaders of the country,
Mm.
and you can start calling yourself a king as well.
Now, what do you say to the fascists that don't necessarily want it to be hereditary? They think that it could very well be hereditary, maybe, but it wouldn't be a policy. So, for example, you would have a fascistic leader that would choose someone of good quality, like let's say someone who is like a young child who, or like like maybe 13, 14 years old, from a good family, and then raise them to be the next fascistic leader. But it wouldn't necessarily have to be or require to be hereditary. What do you think about that?
Well, I believe in the promotion of the sort of Christian value of having a family and raising a family, and I think that when you tie, not only obviously when you have a fascist or a monarch, you tie their entire success to the success of the country, which basically protects them in the long run. You have these politicians that are in for 4 years or 8 years and take out massive loans and screw the country over. But when you have it as hereditary, you're not only tying your own survival to it, but the survival of your whole genetic line. And I think that has more of an effect on people than someone, some random child that they raise from birth, or whatever have you.
Right. And do you think that there are any conceivable issues with simple, like if you just had hereditary inheritance, are there any issues with that? Do you think that in your system, would it be possible to marry outside the family? Where would the next
Sure.
uh, wife or husband come from? You
Okay.
would
So
go ahead.
certain other royal families would be allowed. I would allow marrying to aristocrats, knights, people, other noble people who, are have landowner titles and things like that in
Right.
the UK. Maybe even very prominent businessmen who've shown themselves to be loyal to the church. I wouldn't keep the genetic pool too tight because I know that can create problems.
Exactly. That's kind of what I was getting at, is that there are some issues when you have these long lines of political marriages or incestual marriages. You know, there are some issues with that. Yeah, exactly. The Habsburg, and you know, at the beginning of the 20th century, all the kings in Europe were basically cousins, and that's not necessarily a good thing as far as genetic variety is concerned. Now, what would you say to someone who is opposed, who maybe still a fascist, but is opposed to hereditary inheritance? Is there a way that you could convince them to come over to the bright side?
I don't know if there's a way I could convince them. I think the only thing I would probably bring up to them is the genetic line fact. I understand where they're coming from, but and people always say, you know, the main thing against having a hereditary line would be what happens if you get a bad one?
Right.
What happens if you get, you know, a bad leader? But if you look at the English monarchy, they've always had a way to deal with this. I think it was Edward the Sixth, right?
Right.
He was only king for like 6 months. He was shagging married women, so they abdicated him. The rest of the family has power under the system. The whole royal family works as a unit and operates as almost
Exactly.
like an organization.
Now,
and obviously you have Princess Diana too. So
right, so there would be a large extended family sort of that has a right to claim the throne. It's not just one single genetic line. Now, what do you think about extending this to the aristocracy? Like, obviously, there are different tiers of the aristocracy in the kingdom, but would that extend to non-family members that happen to be a part of this high society?
Aristocrats are able to marry in, but they would not be considered royalty unless they marry in first.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like, there are some people who take it as, some monarchists I've talked to say that the aristocracy, no matter how high on the ladder they are, even if they marry into the royal family, they can never hold any power. What do you think about that?
I disagree.
Right.
I disagree. I think the best should be at the top. And if they want to tie their genetic line to the success of the country, then I'm all for that. I want the best people in our country to tie their success and their genetic line success to the country's success. I think that's best for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And is there any particular way that you would vet the aristocracy for taking this position? Would you have like a council of well-informed or well-knowledgeable people that would sort of test the new people before they marry into the royal family? Or
sure, I mean, you would have your own version of your secret service type things, your CIA, your MI6. Every country would need something like that. So you would have something like that. You would look into everyone, of course, same way that the royal family does at the moment. They go with MI6, they go really deep into your history, who you know, everyone you've ever talked to, what you've done, what you've posted online, to where you've worked.
I assume this would include their support of the church as well, how pious they are.
Yeah, true. That would also include that. You would have to be religious. Non-religious people would not be allowed to marry him.
Obviously. If it's a Christian, divine right monarchy, you can't have an atheist on the throne.
Yeah. You can't even have a non-Christian. Really a non-Protestant.
I see. So what do you think about some philosophers in the past who've lived under this type of monarchy? What do you say to them who they think it's an absolute right of the people to sort of replace the monarchy if they see fit? Do you see that as a right of the people, or?
I don't believe the rights necessarily exist. I believe that your rights exist as much as you're strong enough to protect them. I believe that might makes right. If you don't have the power to take the monarchy down, then they're right.
Well, now that kind of begs the question: what if you have 100 million people that suddenly start storming the Palace of Versailles with pitchforks? What do? Technically, they do have more power.
Yeah, sure. They would probably win. in that case, the monarchy obviously wasn't good enough. They weren't effective enough at their job. They can't have been the best of the best, or else they would have been able to control the social unrest and ail the problems facing their country long enough to stay in power.
Gotcha. Okay. Just kind of clarifying some points here. You know, there's so many different schools of monarchism. Some people are more in favor of sort of just like an aristocracy, like a democratic aristocracy, which doesn't make much sense. Some people,
Mine's is like, I kind of model mine's off of the jungle. Like, you should have an alpha leading, the strongest, the best should be leading.
right?
And if they're destroyed, if they're killed, then fair enough. They weren't strong enough to be at the top in the first place.
It's a very naturalist worldview, which I
That's how I
agree
believe
with
we should operate.
a lot of ways. So, Ulfric, you wanted to chime in there? You were saying something?
I forgot what I said.
God damn it. This is very well organized. No, we're just having a nice chat. We got some other guys in here, Julius and Arian, first name, last name. If you guys want to chime in, go for it. You're all unmuted.
Well, I generally agree with Swish's opinions. I'm not that religious myself, but that's more to do with my upbringing and such. So I probably wouldn't be so close to the religious aspects of it, but I definitely see the hereditary aspects and how you could justify them even without the religious aspects.
Absolutely, yeah. I kind of take a similar stance to that because I'm not a Christian, and I don't think I would necessarily want to live under a Christian divine right monarchy, just because of how important religion is. I'm not saying you couldn't, but I personally wouldn't want to live in that type of system. So,
could I chime in?
sure, go ahead.
On the thing about, you said there was different types of divine right monarchy. There was one which legislated based on the Bible and one that legislated based on the fact that he was chosen by God. So
Well, there's one that doesn't legislate and one that does, essentially.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. Well, I kind of lean more towards the legislating based on the Bible, because like if he is chosen by God to lead his country, then his will is captive to God, and so he can't really go above God or beyond him.
Right. That was essentially how they interpreted it before the divine right time period. They essentially said that God is absolute, and His words have already essentially been written down in the commandments and some of the scriptures. I think there were some religious texts that Christians don't use anymore that they were also interpreting from, but it was pretty resolute, and it seemed to last several hundred years with minimal breakdown. It could just be a lack of known history, but it seems pretty stable.
Yeah. But I think that the issues that are not brought up in the Bible, like I don't know, like cars and stuff. But things that are not brought up in the Bible, he should be able to legislate however he sees best fit. If it's not explicitly taken up as you should like this, doing it this way is wrong, you should do it that way because God said it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it really is up to the interpretation of the ruler. I guess it just depends on how far they want to take things. Many of them saw themselves as literally God incarnate, and some others just saw themselves as more of a vicar, just a priest in the material world that's there to represent the will of God, which is an interesting interpretation. It seems to fit the Christian worldview fairly well.
If I may chime in something?
Go for it.
Yeah, I would say religion seems to be partly fairly important for, so not to judge anybody, but to certain people's lives, which I guess would be one of the arguments for why it would be necessary, or not necessary, but favorable in in a state, in a more what should I say, state that focuses on the maintenance and protecting of the Western people. I would say that the religion, at least how we see the sort of how people are now, it would be religion in any sort of structured way would be more favorable. I think you kind of need something to structure your life because a lot of people have lost it. Which I as a reference, it's kind of the way the reason why I see so many needs ending up like they do, because they need something to structure their lives, and they lack this part.
Yeah, I mean that's essentially why it seems to me a natural and logical expression of human nature is some form of central authority of some kind, whether it's fascism or national socialism or monarchism of some kind. It seems to be absolute power is the best way to govern in some aspects, and that the whole democratic system has essentially failed us. It's failed to secure anything. It's completely degenerated our societies. It's a soul-crushing system of governance.
Yeah, I think you kind of lack, especially with the eradication of hierarchy, you kind of begin to lack sort of something to strive upwards towards in society.
Yep.
So it almost, if you could what is sort of illustrated as a pyramid, everything just sort of falls out to the sides and begins to deviate off in strange and often, dare I say, degenerate ways, or more, what should I say, unhelpful, maybe not unnatural, because some people maybe find some certain natural things, but it's just this obsession with so many sort of habits or actions that just seem so secondary, so much focus on the personal and the me.
Yeah, the individualism is awful. I mean, there's no national spirit left. There's no unity amongst a country when you introduce individualism. And that's the primary reason why things have gotten the way they are today, is that there's no unifying force. So whether it's religion or not, you know, everything that can unify people has been broken down. You know, there's no racial unity amongst Europeans anymore. There's no religious unity. I'm not saying that it ever was a huge thing, but you know, when you have a country that's 99% one religion, that's pretty damn unifying. And then there's no unity in governance either. It's all just a bureaucratic nightmare.
I think, as you mentioned before, with people and the right sort of storming the Versailles, I think even that was sort of a positive thing, because you had a monarch, you had a local nobleman that you could actually hold responsible for things. Now in our modern democracy, like, just for example, in America, you can't really blame Trump because he can't get certain things done, because then there's the people in Congress and then there's the lawmakers, and it kind of always shifts the blame around. There's no one to take up the real responsibility, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's no accountability, and the way that the legal system is sort of tied down to certain laws, there's no way to hold these people accountable. It's like Hillary Clinton, for example. Come on, we all fucking know that she's guilty of some shit. But the legal system and her status in society keeps us from acting in a specific way in order to actually bring justice down upon those who have done ill. So it seems like when we had a central authority, justice was actually possible. It doesn't seem like that anymore. Too many people are getting away with too much bad, for lack of a better term.
I like when you could put people in a dungeon. I want to put Hillary Clinton in a dungeon.
So long as it's legitimate, if you know what I mean. So long as it's legitimate. If it's beyond any reasonable doubt, they should receive the full punishment of the law. And whether it's divine law or what, you know, some justice has to be done. And that's really, I was talking to Culture Thug yesterday, that's really the European spirit. The thing that separates us from so many other groups of people is that essential justice that must be done. It seems that way all throughout history, that there's some
all the way.
Yeah, all the way back to some of the first societies. Justice and honor is a key part of our way of life, and without that, everything kind of falls apart. You know.
I would say that the Icelandic, the Icelanders in the early and the middle medieval stages were a fine example of this. This you know thirst for justice, in that they had a interesting tendency to go out of their way to right wrongs that were done against their family.
Yeah, exactly.
Often, I mean, blood wars on Iceland weren't uncommon. Entire families would hate themselves. They hate each other rather for slights or unjust deeds done against one or the other, and they would go to great lengths to settle a score.
And I think you see it all the way, sort of really, really coming into form during the Roman Empire, sort of with their legal system, which is inherited a great deal from. But if I may jump a little bit back to something you said before, Mimir, it was about the unifying forces. I think there's no grand historical narrative, I would almost say, as a people. You don't have this feeling that that you have something in the past that has led you to this point, and as such that you should take care of yourselves and the future. There's no great tale about your people, and I think that's really what helps. As an example, sort of the Jewish people to keep together in their unity is this tale they can tell themselves about their people throughout time, and I think that's really been lost. And again, you see it also in Black communities. This tale they can tell about their people and their struggle. It may not be the most grandiose or the most accomplished tale, but it's certainly this historical narrative, this sort of feeling that you're connected to your ancestors, that their actions and what happened to them has led you to this point.
Yeah,
exactly. There's been a concerted effort to strip Europe of any of its history, and that's very obvious. I think one of the most important things that people can do is to study European history. And I when I was in high school, I took European history, and I think it was only filled with white people. Was it? It's a really small class because it was the first year they were offering it, but there were very few people who were actually interested in it. Some Spaniards, the other couple of white people that I knew at the time, and I think there were a couple Jews in there as well. But that class really stood out to me in what we learned, because it was a whole year-long study of things that I'd never even been taught about before, ever. It was very interesting. So if you have the opportunity to study European history, do it, because it really is important. And on top of that, I think it's also really important to establish a family tree as well, because when you do that, if you know the history and you have a very long family tree, you can put a name, I guess, a name or even a face sometimes to that certain time period. And when I finally did that, I felt a distinct connection to that time period for some reason. I couldn't explain why, but I just did. When you put because when you think of the past, do you really think about a specific person outside of like someone who's well known? Well, not really, So when you can put like a common person's name and where they lived and maybe their life story to a historical time period, it's very interesting.
I would say it's very important. I had an interesting experience in this regard. It wasn't done by me; it was done by other family members, and one side of the family did quite extensive research into the family line, because there was this interesting story as to how that the progenitor of that family line happened to come to the country in which I live, and quite a few individuals that were described in this book that had been assembled based on all the research. They stood out to me, and it anchors you to yourself in a way, like through your own.
You have a connection. You have a distinct connection to history.
Yes.
It doesn't become this abstract concept anymore. It becomes so much real to you. It becomes something that's
You feel part of the world,
Yeah.
right? Even though you may have not lived as long. My ancestors have. They may not have contributed. Perhaps they weren't grand, kings or rulers, but they also had their stories to tell, and it's very interesting to find stuff like that.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Especially, I guess I would consider it very lucky that I have a lot of English blood in me, because goddamn, the English are good at keeping records. So there's several books that span back to, I don't know, the 1300s of the exploits of some members of the family, because they were not wealthy by any means, but they owned land, and so reading about their lives and kind of what they did is extremely interesting, and especially on the German side of my family, I was reading about this one guy who fought in the was it the 30 Years War, the Protestants versus the Catholics? I don't remember, but
Yes.
yeah. So I was reading about the 30 Years War, and then I realized, oh hey, one of my ancestors actually fought in that war, lived through it. He lived in the Rhineland-Palatinate in West Germany, and the village that he settled down in after surviving the war is still around today. And it's like, man, that's crazy to think about, because we don't normally think about these things, especially in America. No one ever teaches you about this. Like hardly anyone. There's every person I talk to has absolutely no connection at all to history unless they're non-white. But even then, it's kind of a shame that a lot of the non-whites they can't really trace back their lineage that far, but even the little that they can is very inspiring to them. So we've lost that in Western society. Go ahead.
I'd also say, again, it's mostly the same here in Europe. Sort of the entire era of a lot of sort of hanging shot, it never came up in our classes. We often hear about the most classical and mundane things. So I would say, again, let's focus on history would be great.
Yeah, I mean, everyone, we spend what, like an entire month dedicated to the Holocaust, but we can't even spend one day learning about, the land around us or the history of it. It's a shame. Oh man, any other talking points? Someone else want to chime in? We've got a couple people in here.
I think I should say my opinions on monarchy.
Go for it.
Yes, I simply think that there should be, in my ideal nation, there should be a dictator, and when the dictator gets too old, like 60, he appoints the most ideal person to take his place. And because I just feel, I'm convinced that his son or his children won't fit the criteria. They won't be ideal. They won't want that position. But if you give it to your son that doesn't want to be king, that's what I think. And I think also the aristocracy. Go on.
I was saying my worry would be if you have the system where the dictator can appoint the next leader, you could very easily have an old dictator in his 80s being coerced and forced into making someone who he necessarily
60,
was not wanting
60
to
is
be
the
the leader.
maximum age.
Well, regardless,
After
he could be
60,
20,
yeah.
he could be 35, but he could be coerced by another into giving him this position. So that position could be taken by force. Whereas if it's hereditary, there's no logical or legal way or a divine way that you could take that throne.
Well,
but
you go first.
But very quick. No, I think the dictator slash king, he could easily immediately be impeached, kicked out, replaced, or taught a lesson. I think there should be an like aristocratic senate and a cabinet of technocrats and all this stuff, and with a majority coalition, they could easily impeach or kick him out if he goes crazy. So there should always he has to be in fear.
I would say hereditary monarchy, talking about some of other observations throughout history, with again in context to my own nation, hereditary monarchy really didn't sort of play out in any sort of great way for at least my own country. So I would at least be opposed to on the basis that it often has the potential to do more harm than good. I'd say if you have a great genetic lineage, and you can find a way to sort of secure this lineage, which I think would be a lot easier in this modern time.
I think this need for security to secure something if you can 100% know that it's going to work, if you can definitely, I think this mindset, this lack of risk taking is what's created this comfortable society, which is just degenerated through the democratic system. I think that, yeah, it is risky, yeah, it is dangerous, but life is dangerous. And I think that if we try and change that, we're only blinding ourselves to the real world.
Well, now, what happens when you end up with someone like Henry VIII, who has multiple wives, but none of them bear a son? Obviously, you would go and find someone from another part of the family or the aristocracy or something like that. But how would you ensure that that new king or queen or whatever has been raised properly? Because the best thing about monarchism is that when you have a child, they are essentially raised from birth to perform one job. Sure. So if you have to go outside of these children of, you know, the ruler, how do you ensure that they've been raised properly? I mean, because you could essentially raise like 5 kids at once, all for the eventual goal of taking on the crown. But what do they do when it doesn't pan out, if there's no emergency and, you know?
So if the king cannot have children, he's not able to bear children type thing. And what would you do in that scenario? Was that the initial question? I'm confused.
Yeah. Sorry, that was a lengthy question. What are you going to do? Let me rephrase it.
If the king, if you have to choose a king who isn't, or a child for the next king who isn't raised to be king.
So the thing with the royal family is you would tend to have a large extended royal family. You'd have cousins and sisters and brothers of kings and queens. Sure. So you would have people who are second in line, third in line, fourth in line, 20th in line for the throne. And these people are all raised to a high standard with leadership in mind of some position, and through the church with religion. So they tend to be pretty well adaptable to get into that kind of mindset.
It would seem to me that there's a unique experience when you are the prince of a nation. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
You know, when you're around the king's court as a prince, you're treated a little bit differently. You're privy to a lot more information than other people. Are you going to have like a little set of like courtesans who take care of the kid? Like you have like a whole bunch of kids that are around the king all at the same time, like sort of raising them in the same way? Or what do you think?
I would have their parents raised. There's no substitute. You would obviously have times when their parents are busy, and then hopefully they would be homeschooled to a very high standard, or sent to a very, very esteemed private school.
May I ask which?
Maybe even a military school.
That was actually sort of my question. What kind of direction would you take the education? Of course, civil management would be one of the things, but then
depends what they were each individually good at. I would hope that some of them would go into military leadership roles. You know,
every young son should be trained with a sword. Absolutely. Well, you know what I mean. But
can I ask you a question?
Go ahead, Waylon.
In regards to this hypothetical prince in training, would you, as part of his education, would you, for instance, force him to do hard labor so he knows a hard day's labor throughout his education, so that he essentially doesn't have not paper pusher, but
he doesn't end up a prissy faggot.
Yes, and sits too much at the school bench, and yes, teacher,
sure.
Yes, right. Yeah.
as the leader of the military, you would have the best military combat instructors available. So they would be in, and they'd be in that from very young on, getting prepared for hopefully military deployment at some point, and maybe leadership.
So okay, so you would be willing to risk the prince's future by sending him on campaign, and would
Sure,
would he
but,
have to? And would he have to do this? Would he
wouldn't
have to go on a
no.
campaign?
You wouldn't have to, no.
Okay.
Well, you would have to, just like
But it's like an Asian family. You don't have to get any, but
Well,
we would like you to.
the optimal way to raise a son, even if you're not royalty, is to have him experience hard labor, because struggle is the most important part of forming bonds with other men, which is a healthy part of raising a son, obviously. So I think that there should be some type of national program in which young boys and men are taken out into the world and perform physical labor of some kind. And that would have to include, I think, the royal family, because we don't want any prissy little soft-handed school kids running around.
yes.
So
You
I
don't-
don't think in
Later.
particular that just military training is enough. Like, sure, they're going to get their ass kicked every now and again, but they actually, I think they need to go out there and experience the plight of the working man. Spend a week with a mason, spend a week with an engineer, or I don't know, some type of someone who works with their hands, essentially, and allow them to experience that way of life. I think that's a very important thing.
I very much agree. Yes, and I was going to suggest, teaching them how to build their own wooden cabin, for instance.
Yep. A 16-year-old birthday test. Build a fucking house or you're getting kicked out.
Drop them off in the middle of the forest. Well then,
Well, maybe not.
Have a home.
Maybe not the prince, but you know. So Mullock in the chat says HEMA as a mandatory sport in martial art. Absolutely. If HEMA, I think, is really important. The problem is that there's not very many local chapters, especially not in the United States. It's very rare that you'll find even one that's high quality. So if you can find it and you can afford to do it, absolutely do it. Absolutely train. Not only is it physical activity, but it's fucking fun as hell to beat someone with a stick, you know? There's just something about it. Has anyone here ever done HEMA before?
No, I don't know what it is actually.
Historical European martial arts. There's it's sort of like
Kingdom Come, but except in real life.
exactly. But there's multiple different things you can do, and it depends on who the founders of the school are. So you have some people who are extreme specialists in Italian longswordmanship. You have some people who are experts in Polish saber combat. You have some people who are maybe experts in Greco-Roman wrestling or grappling or something like that. Fencing is also another one, but fencing, I guess you could call it HEMA, but the modern version of it isn't as fun as, long swordsmanship or something like that. So, and it's a fairly common thing for people nowadays. Like, just go on YouTube and look up HEMA training or HEMA tournament. It's a pretty big event, and it's a lot of fun.
It certainly seems a lot of fun.
Moloch says, stick, get a real long sword or saber, you fuck. Yeah, well, I mean, you can't just hand a 5-year-old a sharpened saber and expect them not to hurt themselves. You gotta start somewhere. Especially when you're saber training, you start out with that like leather saber shaped like pillow looking thing. I don't remember what it's called, but you gotta start somewhere. Glakun Khan says, thoughts on Spartan society. Plato idealized the Spartan state, as can be seen in the Republic, and Hitler did as well. Any thoughts, gentlemen?
The Spartan society was pretty gay.
It's just a
Yeah,
little
the
homo.
The Greeks' proclivities of homosexuality is unfortunate, but
I would not hold it as an ideal, to be honest.
I would say it's an important thing to study and maybe idealize their warrior spirit, but as far as their actual city-state governance is concerned, there's not a whole lot you can learn from it. Like, I wouldn't want to base my entire society on how the Spartans live, because that's a little bit, outdated.
yeah,
But there are certain things you can learn.
The slavery part, it's like
Yeah,
such a waste.
not a
such
big
waste.
fan. Also not a big fan of like abusing young sons and then things like that. Like there's a
I would also the also, even if you have to have slaves, the ratio was totally off the charts with the Spartans. They had to watch themselves constantly.
I
to
mean,
not
they
get
did
sta-
they did kill helots as a coming of age.
and that I think that we now know through some scientific studies, and I talked about this a lot, is that things like that actually only increase the likelihood that you're going to foster mental instability in young men. And I think it's important to have physical training and, of course, to weed out the weak. But there's a difference. There's a line that you just can't cross when you're training sons. You know, they're not going to respect authority if you literally abuse them. You know, I don't want an army full of slaves. I actually want a highly intelligent Ubermensch, you know, sort of like the SS, you know.
Yeah.
They were trained extremely hard, but it wasn't abuse.
I would also say that the slave populations, just to return to that subject, sort of lowers the national spirit, because you have people who would have an easy time sort of defecting because they have no bond to the land and the people. So you'd have to watch your back. It would be a lot easier with sort of people who just felt with just normal citizens who felt great about the nation.
Yeah, absolutely. And this kind of, I don't mean to get off topic, but it kind of goes into the National Socialist ideal when it comes to property rights. Property rights are very important in a hierarchical society, but instead of doing the dirty communist way of nationalizing industry and nationalizing property, just nationalize the laborers, instill a spirit or virtue in them, and then you don't have to expropriate their stuff, essentially. So you need a spirit to sweep over the nation, and then you solve a lot of issues. Yeah, the whole slavery thing, I think, I really don't want an enslaved foreign population in my society. No thanks.
Look at the United States. Prime example.
Yeah.
This is where slavery gets you, people. Look at the United States.
Mulek says, it's a great sport, and you'll learn some practical self-defense along the way with knife-dagger fighting, as well as Ringen, which is German folk wrestling. Yes, very, very, very important. We had a couple more people, but I think they might have left. Any other topics you guys want to get over? Arian, you've been quiet this whole time. I don't know if you want to chime in with something.
I think he wrote in the chat he's at work, so he can't chime in with.
I gotcha. Yeah, let me open up the text channel here. Will you ever host one of these live events on a weekend? Yeah, sure. Probably this Saturday, if anything. Let's see. Let me read his message here. The current would be the most pragmatic. 100% in favor of what Swishy is saying. Count me out of the chat, though. I'm at work. Gotcha. I gotcha. Welcome, everybody. We got some more people talking in the chat here. Any other topics you guys want to bring up? Here we go. Mulek, you're unmuted. If you'd like to talk, just unmute yourself. Swishy, Wayland, anything you guys want to talk about? Ulfric?
I have maybe something in the way of foreign relations. What are your guys' view upon that? How a state, even sort of to continue a train of thought that we have built up, sort of this monarchy that we've been talking about for some time now. How would your view upon foreign relations be?
Well, I mean, foreign relations are extremely important, especially if we want to not repeat the mistakes of the past, sort of this mercantilist or isolationist policy. I don't want warfare with the people around me. That just causes instability. And I think it's also bad for, the health and spirit of the nation. Warfare is not necessarily a good thing. There are some positives, but most of the time it's not necessary. So foreign relations are very important. But at the same time, you have to understand that capitulating or looking weak is not a good thing as well. Foreign trade, I think, is very important, especially when you're talking about an area that doesn't have specific resources. If you're going to have to trade for platinum or even something as simple as like steel or iron, you're going to have to develop a good relationship with other people. So being antagonistic is not a good thing.
Yeah, especially when the globalization and modern economics have interwoven the fate of nations so thoroughly with each other. It's this reason alone, even though you could conceivably get your nation self-sufficient on a number of different items that you need for whatever you're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
Norway is a good example of this, for instance, completely and utterly self-sufficient in regards to electricity. We
Yep.
sell our electricity. As a matter of fact, the EU has been desperate to get their hands on it, and they recently did as well. But that's not here or there. But it is. I mean, yeah, you should, above all, you should try and hold a good relations with your neighbor and other states as possible. And but always remember that even though how good your relations are with any other foreign power, they are going to spy on you, and you are going to do the same back.
Yep. It's an unfortunate side effect of the human condition, but I would say that we would try and foster some sort of positive relationship with the people around us, especially nations who have, similar interests at heart, similar forms of government, especially in particular, similar racial groups. Like in Europe, there's no reason for
Scandinavian.
there's no reason for Norway and Sweden to go to war against one another unless Sweden becomes the next caliphate. So
Yeah.
I actually saw a funny article a while back. A Swedish minister proposed that Sweden should go to war with Denmark over a part of the land, southern Sweden. I think it's called Skåne. And if I'm mistaken, just so Sweden could capitulate a couple of hours later, sort of to give the Danes Skåne, because
Holy
it's
shit.
where Malmö lies, where a lot of the immigrants are.
holy shit, that's fucking. I mean, that's like peak Sweden right there.
That's peacockery. Would you go to war just to capitulate?
Jesus Christ, Sweden! What the fuck? What happened? Oh my god!
That feeling when Sweden used to be a great superpower and when they up against fucking Russia and shit, and now this.
Where's my fucking Carl Gustav? Where is he? Come back! The spirit of Carl Gustav, come back!
Yeah.
Cleanse the fucking country.
Oh, but he still exists, my friend, in the form of an 84mm recoilless rifle.
That's essentially like what he should be.
That if Carl Gustav could see the modern Sweden, he would kill himself.
He's spinning so hard. He's spinning so hard in his grave. Norway's looking at it to use for electricity.
So that's why the EU bureaucrats want to get hold of us.
Yeah, exactly.
Now it all makes sense.
Yeah.
Kind of back to the foreign trade here. Traveling Blues 89 says, I would almost go as far as to say that we become completely self-sufficient and do not engage in foreign trade. I just don't trust other people, especially foreign nations who have different goals. Now, I think that self-sufficiency, especially when it comes to the essentials like food production, steel or iron, cloth.
You sort of wouldn't end up like Germany in First World War, where sort of blockades screwed you over and sort of trade in the spirit or for resources, for expensive, more scientific sort of things would be more acceptable, whereas essentials, I would agree, definitely.
Yeah, the essentials should be self-sufficient in case of war, but especially like scientific trade between countries is very important. Intellectual trade, having like these intellectual exchange programs between universities, I think is very important. Now, when you say foreign, you kind of have to differentiate what you mean by foreign. Do you mean the guy who you're sharing a border with, or do you mean the guy on the opposite side of the world? Because I think there's a difference there. The guy right next to you may have some common goals in mind in which you can work together and make yourself stronger. I think that this constant insistence on isolationism is not necessarily a good thing. And there are some materials that your country may lack. So
I wouldn't, just for example, I wouldn't just, if I had the possibility to fuck either sort of South Africa or Japan over, it's quite clear which one I would go for.
Yeah.
And just in sort of, how do people view the Asiatic nations, sort of China, North and South Korea, and Japan, the more northern Asian
well,
nations?
I have a lot of respect for the East Asians because they're relatively similar to us. Maybe not as advanced, but they're entirely respectful and respectable in the way that they operate. With the exception of the Chinese communists. We're talking pre-communist China before they were taken over, but many of their schools of thought are very similar to our own, and I have no issues engaging in trade with them per se. Let's see.
Yeah, and they also have the added benefit of, speaking as a European, they're on the other side of the world. So added benefit, China will grow to a regional power, and Japan and South Korea will be there to stop their expansion going too far in, friendly relations as far as it is possible.
Yeah. Traveling Blue says, that's true. Maybe someone like Canada is more on the same page as us, but our southern border, not so much. Yeah, isolationism is not exactly the best thing in the world, as I've said. So maybe rethink it a little bit. Maybe just a little bit. Any other thoughts on monarchy or anything, guys? We can move on.
I have another question.
Sure.
Wait, I have one last thing.
Okay, go ahead.
I can't get over the fact that I just can't submit that you could mold your son. You could mold a future leader. Or how would you say instead of mold? That
Raise.
if you have a kid and you...
Sort of genetically specify how they should be born.
Yes, monarchy makes sense in the past because most people didn't know how to read and were ignorant. They couldn't run a country, so only the aristocracy and the king could educate his son and teach him military tactics, etc., etc. But now that most people, right, are educated in school, it's more ideal to pick the most, the best leader. Because even if you educate your son, many times he wouldn't want to become king. He'll just...
Well, if you're king and you're raising your son and you're actually doing it properly, he's going to want to be king. People nowadays don't know how to raise sons anymore because they're taking the modern soy boy approach to it, sort of hands-off, playful garbage. You need to, if you want your sons or your children to end up with the same culture as you need to be. Don't be such a pussy about it. You need to command respect as a parent. So that's the issue that we have today. But
that would be very common in an ethno state that kids are raised in a correct manner and stuff.
Sure, but
so
as the prince, you have a unique access to the court, to the wisdom of your father who's currently ruling. You have the entire nation at your disposal in order to learn. And if even in a fascist system, the average person, even if they're genetically qualified, if they're hyper intelligent, if they know how to rule, there is some experience that you need in order to go into this effectively. And that's the best thing about monarchism, is that the next leader, the son of the king, has spent his entire life surrounded by this. It's like when you go into a job for the first time and they teach you how to do the job. Well, you don't really feel comfortable or confident in this job until maybe a year or two later. But by the time the prince takes power, he's already going to have 18, 20, sometimes even 30 years experience underneath his belt, in which the transition of power is so easy. It's just boop and then done. That's it. That's all it requires, because he's already prepared for this his entire life.
But historically, the most ideal person to run the country grew up, homeless, for example, wasn't aristocratic, So I just feel in in a future state, the most ideal person to take place as dictator wouldn't be the king's son, even though he was raised and would be, would do a good job. I feel like just a random citizen that had a different life as the prince would be 10 levels ahead of him. So we shouldn't just roll dice.
Just appoint the poor person.
It's the randomness that irks me, because essentially what we're trying to do is reduce the amount of overall conflict within the society, right? And if you introduce a random person into a leadership position, you don't know. There's no real way of knowing how they're going to act. But if you take someone who has been raised from birth with the intention to rule, you can monitor them through their childhood. You can see how they are as a young adult. You can get their opinions on things. You know for certain that they are prepared to rule. And yeah, there have been historical examples of this not working. Sure, there's historical examples of literally anything humans do not working. But our intention is to create the best possible system with the least amount of variables that could lead to the complete downfall of the society. And that's one of the best motivators I have for monarchism.
Yes, I just think you're born to rule. You're not taught to rule. You can be, but if we're looking for an ideal ruler, you're born,
So would not the previous king or the current king's son be born to rule? Have the genetic...
No, actually, I think many times the king's son is actually not born to rule. That a random, peasant is born to rule.
Yeah, but the prince is literally born to rule, though, in a literal sense. That's his entire purpose.
And I would say even in our modern world,
I get it.
Even if the argument about whether it would be ethical is another thing, but you could genetically modify your child or the future prince.
Oh, don't do that. No, don't fuck with genes. Do not fuck with genes. But I mean, it's very hard to quantify what exactly someone is born to rule. Okay, you can look at someone and say, "Oh, that guy's a natural leader." It's like, okay, well, what is his experience? What are his beliefs? Was he raised within the traditions of society? Does he have any secrets that he's not willing to tell you? Things like that. With a prince, you knock out all of those variables all at once because you've been monitoring him and growing him from a young age. And if you raise him properly, he's going to want to become king. But many of the rulers of Europe in the past didn't really have the knowledge that we have now about how to raise children properly, or they didn't have the historical knowledge of what happened in the past in order for us to correct it. I mean, because we have access to the totality of human knowledge at our fingertips. So basically anyone can learn from the mistakes of the past. It's very easy to do that.
So you think if the king was given the option to pick the person he thinks would be the most ideal to rule the country, he would pick his son because he raised him to, be the future king? I don't think so. I think he would pick
it's not his choice.
Well,
it's not his choice in a hereditary system. It's not his choice. It goes to the oldest son. Now, I would prefer it if the king had the option to pick someone if he truly believes that his sons are not capable of doing it. That's surely an option, but the default position, just based on the system in and of itself, is that the oldest son of the king has the right to rule next. That's the next logical step.
What type of power would the king have? Would he be a dictator? What type of power would he have?
It depends on what type of system, what kind of monarchy you have, as we talked earlier.
But you said you want an autocratic monarchy, right?
Well, there's stepping stones in my system. We were talking to Swishy earlier about his vision is some type of Christian divine right legislation monarchy, which is slightly different from my own. But are you asking about me in particular?
Yeah.
Well, I see fascism or National Socialism as a stepping stone to a potential monarchy many generations down the line. The only issue I have with monarchy as a practical solution to problems now is that there's no way to effectively establish it because we don't have a natural aristocracy anymore. It's all the only indicator of someone's value today is someone's money, not their virtue, not their wisdom. What else did I talk about? Not their their values as a person. It's just how much money they can collect, and that's not an aristocracy. That's garbage.
That's true from an American standpoint, though. In Europe, that's not the case.
Well, it's the case in virtually all pop cultures. I mean, you might have some outliers, sure. That's not what I was saying, but most people, if you're well known and you have some money, okay, so now you're an icon, a figurehead of some kind. It's not the way it used to be in the olden days, I guess you could say.
Sure. But we do have an ability still alive and well in Europe.
Oh yeah,
Yes,
it's just it's not predominant though. That's what I'm saying. We have the capability, but we're not doing it based on our culture. Go ahead, Waylon.
Yeah, I was going to say Europe may have royalty left, but I mean, considering what has been left. I mean, first of all, they're toothless. They have no real power. They're figureheads. That's one thing. The other one is that I haven't heard any of them open their mouths and complain or even utter any interesting opinion about what the changes are happening in their own countries in Europe. Even if we could reinstate the monarchy, as far as I am concerned, and this is the major problem I have with monarchy as it is, none of them, not a single one, has made themselves worthy in any way
Exactly.
to have any right to rule over the people they claim to be theirs, whom they claim to be part of, and whom they claim to have a right to rule over.
Right. So that therein lies the issue, is that there's no way to effectively do it today or tomorrow or in 5 years or 10 years. There needs to be a complete cultural shift before any of that is possible.
And I'd say with the aristocracy, it's kind of the same way. The current aristocracy is a lot more about the inherited money that they just can sort of keep on piling on to. So it's not anymore about the virtues. There's no more sort of aristocracy tied to the land or the people that live in a certain area.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say the spirit of the aristocracy has gone kind of died away.
Yeah,
the
spirit of the nation is gone in and of itself. But Bob Elvis says, how would a dysfunctional king be replaced in a civil way? I'm from the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Welcome. We talked on this very early on in the stream. Essentially, the royal family would hold a lot of power. And if they can come together in some way, shape, or form, in some quantifiable way, and say, hey, the king is fucking up, or I always saw it as there would be some type of representative body that wouldn't hold any legislative power, but would simply advise the king, sort of like how we have like state governors in the United States, except they wouldn't hold any legislative power or anything. They would simply be advisors to the monarch on how things are going in their particular area. And so if the king stops listening to them, he stops taking the advice of the economic advisors or his generals or something like that, the royal family needs to come together to displace him in some way. And I think it would be something important that's taught to everyone, is that, hey, the monarch is absolute, but if the royal family or if the king starts fucking up, then we need to replace him in some way. Any thoughts, guys?
I mean, if you're going to have a monarchy, then such a notion is very important, yes.
Glakun Khan says, isn't meritocratic aristocracy preferable to monarchy? I'm not sure what you mean. What type of legislative? Let me know what type of legislative power these aristocrats have, because if you're dividing power amongst many individuals, it leads to conflict, and we don't want conflict. That's why we want a central authority in a monarch, because this sort of division of power amongst little subdivision like dukes or whatever leads to some type of conflict, and then eventually you end up with a monarchy anyway. It's just a natural evolution of human desire.
I'd say the best sort of expression of this thought I think we've seen so far in history would be sort of the early Roman Republic with the Senate, but even that ended up collapsing when it got sort of above the size of a general city-state. It begins to become harder to operate with the system.
Yeah, it's completely untenable to have a unified nation with like 250 different legislators. It's just not possible, especially when you get into extremely large populations like we have today. The United States is 320 plus million people. You know, if you think that we're going to get anything done, which we haven't, in a Congress or Senate, you're out of your mind. And that's why I'm in favor of reducing these legislative bodies down to a specific area. As Hobbes stated, the only way you could do that is through war. That's from Traveling Blues. Yeah, I mean, not necessarily. Maybe historically, yeah. But I think that if we're going to instill a new monarchy, that there are ways to prevent that. We got some new people here in the chat. Welcome to the show, Oof Goof. What's going on?
Not for much. I just got invited here.
Cool. Anything you want to talk about? Any topic? We've been talking about monarchy.
I'll tune into your stream and I'll go back a bit on it, see what we've been talking about beforehand.
we started out with divine right monarchy, and now we're just kind of talking about the specifics of it.
You know, the person who invited me here, he also sent me a video that you did with Cultured Thug. I still need to catch up on that, by the way.
Right. That was a good video. I got a lot of positive responses from that, so appreciate it.
I really enjoyed that video. It was very.
I might just. Sorry about that. I might just mute myself and watch it then, guys.
Yeah, go ahead. If anyone wants to chime in anything, let me know. I mean, I've been guiding the conversation a little bit, but I want everyone to kind of speak their piece.
I still had that question.
Yes, go ahead, Ulfric. Sorry.
Yes. So, what's your thoughts on sort of European multiculturalism? To be more specific, the thing that NRM preaches with a Nordic multicultural society where the countries of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland unite into one Nordic republic.
Cancer. First impression, because here's the thing, right? Like each individual country has its own particular way of doing things, and you've been separated for so long that you have a unique culture, a unique language, and unique religion. I think that unifying them and kind of mixing them all together is the same cancerous multiculturalism that we're seeing in with other racial groups. You know, it's the same kind of thing. I don't want, you know, France and Germany to intermix and make, you know, a whole area full of people like Belgium, where it's just kind of mixed together and you've got all these different groups kind of conflicting with each other. You know, I want them to each maintain their uniqueness. You know, that's actual diversity for any leftists out there, maintaining these borders essentially. The diversity of Europe is a very interesting thing.
Can I comment on this?
Go ahead.
What you just said, I mean, this is straight out of the Nordic resistance movements policy papers, and it is one of my biggest gripes with them as an organization, as a national socialist movement. They argue for the united Scandinavia, which includes Finland. I don't see why they would include Finland. I don't consider them Scandinavians. They may be Nordic, but they're not Scandinavian.
Yep.
So, you know, I find it. They don't include Iceland or the Faroes.
What?
Why?
Come on.
Well, they're not.
Yeah.
They're not included as Scandinavian nations. Scandinavia is referring to three nations.
Yeah.
Norway,
Well,
Sweden,
they still saw fit to include. I mean, anyway, I won't labor the point, but yeah, this is one of the gripes I have with them, because what they envision, at least what it sounds to me, I haven't talked to any of them as far as I know, so I haven't gotten any answer from, you know, out of their mouth, but from what I've read from their papers and their party book, basically, is that they envision what will essentially be a EU, but except the EU as we conceive of it today, it is an EU on a smaller scale of the Nordic countries, and I find it absolutely amazing that I don't understand. Considering all the other values they claim to hold so high, I just don't understand how they can.
I would say, like,
labor this point.
Has anyone ever seen what happens when you put a bunch of Swedes and Danish people together? Oh, it's a bloodbath. It's never going to work.
And
Good
also,
idea.
I can agree with that.
and also Norwegians and Swedes, and also Norwegians and Danes.
Oh, but I know what happens when a Dane comes. The first thing you hear is "Camel also."
But I'd say that it even has been tried before with the Kalmar Union,
Mhm.
and you can observe how that ended.
But you see, it wasn't the right system.
Well, the issue with the Kalmar Union was that Denmark was in charge.
Uh-oh, shots fired.
And you'll always have one country that will be basically in charge, and if it's some sort of European Union style thing. And in the European Union, Germany is basically in charge.
Oh, good job, Germany. You fooled us
Mhm.
again. Third time.
Oh, you can stop now, Merkel. The jokes. It's like, oh, it's not a joke. Oh.
Well, they managed to reconstitute the Fourth Reich, so I mean,
Except it's a lefty one, but
it's the Fourth Reich with a communist spin.
well,
just
I'm
real
still,
quick.
I'm still holding out hope that this is like a year-long op.
oh, whoa.
It's just
Whoa,
gonna turn.
hold on. Hold on. Mulek, your mic is a bit communist. It's a little fucky. But just real quick,
Sorry.
Ari says, check my suggestion in the event comment section on Discord. I don't see it. What name are you posting under? Welcome, Sven Bong. I see you in there. You're unmuted if you'd like to talk about Sweden.
Yes, hello.
Oh, there we go.
Glad to be on. Yeah, I know. I heard your conversation about the Nordic countries and come in, voice my opinion. I agree that it's going to be very difficult to get the Swedes to form a potential political union together with the Norwegians and Danes, unless it's possible to redraw the tribal lines to create a new Nordic in-group versus a potential non-Nordic out-group. It's like the enemy of men. Yeah, it's like if you...
Again, I could see it in, for example, like again, Skåne, which has been very fought over, land that's been fought a lot over between Swedes and Danes. Which, I could see that where sort of an example there, and I think there's been something along the lines of that with the Norwegian-Swedish border as well, if I am entirely mistaken.
Yeah, someone mentioned Finland. Finland does not belong to Scandinavia, but I'd just like to say that Finland was part of Sweden for 800 years.
Doesn't matter, different people.
Finland has been part of Sweden for longer than Skåne has.
Yes, but do you want a bunch of drunk, depressed people in Sweden? I mean, more than usual.
Well, that's basically half the country.
Svenbong?
Yes.
If I could chime in. The thing about Finland is that they're genetically and culturally as well as linguistically distinct from Scandinavians.
Yeah.
So putting them in together with Scandinavia. Yeah, that too. Yeah, we say fan, they say perkele.
I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the only good use a Finn may be off to an actual Scandinavian is a bulwark against the Russians.
Don't they make good vodka too?
That too.
No, that's Sweden.
See,
I've never had Swedish vodka, so I wouldn't know.
Absolute vodka is Swedish.
Yeah, I've never had Absolute.
The difference between a Finn and a Swede is that one of them is a small chance likely to be Sami. The other one is 100% likely. That sounded better in my head. Ignore me.
Fucking shots fired.
Will do.
Wait, but hold on. Which is which?
Oh, I'll let you decide.
Oh man, that's funny. Is it getting late over there in old Scandinavia?
It's 11.
Oh jeez.
11? Oh, it's 10 here. Yeah.
Wasn't
Can I have
expecting.
an hour? Can I have an hour? Can I take some time from you, please?
It's not even dinner time over here.
Oof.
Be a good fellow Eurofag and share some of that time.
Who, me?
Share some of that sunlight with the Scandinavians.
Sun landed like 2 hours ago.
We're so poor here in Norway.
Real, I don't believe that.
Yeah. You got
No.
that Danish oil.
Although another interesting fact when it comes to the Scandinavian Union is it's actually a communist idea to begin with.
That's
There
what
you
I've heard.
How dare you not support a national socialist union, right? How dare you not support the Nordic Yugoslavia?
Wait, did you just say in Nordic Yugoslavia?
Yep.
Yeah.
What do we remove? Finns?
Yes. And Swedes and Danes, and then we can have the union
And the Sami.
Yeah.
and the Sami.
Sorry, I'm updating the
So-
title of the stream to Scandinavian Invasion.
So basically, Ulfric, what you want is a bunch of depressed Norwegian people occupying more land. Is that what you want?
Yes.
I mean, does
And
it
people from the
produce more?
Orkneys.
Does it produce? Oh yeah, right. Yeah, we need the Orkneys, of course. I mean, the only reason why I want the Orkneys back into Norwegian control is their distilleries. No other reason.
Norwegian irredentism now.
Oh, actually, I thought of something actually.
Mhm.
Wait, I'm not sure if it was Iceland or Norway, but there's this. Is this a regular cooking show? Not a cooking show, it's a cooking series in the UK. And this guy, who's a fairly well-known TV chef, he went to I think it was Iceland actually. Have you ever heard anyone who's Norwegian here of lamb blood meringue? Apparently, it's very nice.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, anytime you bring up Scandinavia and food, I always question, like, do they have food over there that's edible? Like, it's always some like roasted elk heart or something like surströmming, or
Yeah,
like Jesus
like
Christ.
instead of
people.
eggs.
Hey! Don't knock it unless you try it.
I'm
Yeah,
good.
like instead of eggs, instead of egg whites, they just use lamb's blood instead. It's very
Well,
strange.
blood pancakes are
Hmm.
good, but you know, there's only so much I can tolerate.
I could never eat that. I tried.
Oh,
You should try Smalahove.
Blood sausage is really good, and cooking with blood is good. But I think, I don't know, you guys have taken it a bit too far, in my opinion.
Oh, just wait until the new temple to the Norse gods on Iceland gets finished. That's when the
Oh.
blood really starts flowing.
Oh god. Yeah.
Yeah, you have a whole new cuisine of virgin blood.
Does anybody here dispute that Iceland is rightfully Norwegian?
I thought it was Iceland.
Well, since Norway is rightfully Swedish clay, yes.
I would say
How fucking dare you?
Norway was Danish longer than Swedish.
You gave up your empire long ago, Swede.
Well, Denmark is rightful Swedish clay as well, so I mean,
No.
yes.
So when we say Nordic Union, we really mean Swedish Empire.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure Skyrim
Correct.
belongs to the Nords, so
Wow, this explains why the Nordic resistance movement was started in Sweden, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
Fucking
it's a ploy. It's a trick. Don't fall
It
for
is.
it's a ruse.
they're controlled opposition.
the what did they say in Skyrim again? The emperor is but a puppet of the Thalmor.
Yep.
But doing that voice you do it in Ireland.
I can't be bothered.
Uh-oh.
Oh, yes, the Swedish king is a profitable hammer.
But I would say though, on the subject of Scandinavia, I would gladly invite a union, but closer relations, more helping each other, economically if need be, maybe, and militarily and such. But union, no, not so much. But this cooperation can be. It can be brought on through what's the word when two nations have a mutually agreed upon agreement.
Mhm. But that already exists through the Nordic Council,
Yeah.
though.
Yeah, but the Nordic Council is only for like washing products. They don't really do anything.
Of course, it's a union of bleach.
Yep, they just put their fucking logo on bleach. That's all they do. They discuss different ways of doing that.
No, not really. It covers a lot of things. Tax policy mainly, and environmental policy.
It's basically like a Scandinavian communist international.
Who has rightful ownership over Svalbard?
Norway.
Norway.
Norwegian territory.
Norway and a small part is Russian.
Really? I didn't know about the Russian
Yeah.
part.
It's a city. It's a Soviet mining town.
I'm only familiar with Longyearbyen. Or whatever it's
Longyearbyen.
called. Yeah.
Oh.
Basically, the story behind it is the USSR said, "Oh, we want to mine shit here," and Norway was like, "Yeah, sure."
Yeah, it's the story of the Soviet Union in like one sentence or less. Oh, hey, we're going to start mining here. They set up a fucking town.
They even sell one up
Interesting
to
thing is though that I don't think the Soviets ever got much out of it, to be honest.
Nope,
I
they
mean,
don't.
it's a far-flung territory. For them, it's not. I mean, the distances that country covers
Well,
anyway. But
I mean, when you're trying to leave the hotel and the guy behind the desk hands you a Mauser and says you're going to need this, yeah, probably not the best place for humans to live. Just saying.
On the subject of islands and ownership, then I would pass it at Greenland as Danish.
Uh-oh.
that's
No.
fine. You can have Greenland as long as we get Iceland.
Iceland is rightfully Norwegian, and so is Greenland.
Besides, Greenland has very little. So
Yeah, except Grunkia. It's
nice prison colony for you.
I mean, I'm in favor of moving all Danes to Greenland.
well,
If you're talking about it being a prison colony, then in 100 years' time, they're just going to find a fuck ton of like steel and stuff, well, iron and stuff. So
yeah, I think there has actually been a lot of interest in the northern Arctic Ocean due to some
Yep.
minerals in the ground.
I'll tell you this: there's a lot of activity going on in the Arctic Circle right now that your government isn't telling you about. So just keep that in mind.
Don't worry.
The Russians are. I mean, Norway got their new spy boat not that long ago, so we know they. I mean, I've got a friend in the Navy, and I asked him about this. Right, it's a mechanic, and I asked him, well, what about that new spy boat you guys got? I mean, you had one already, which it was an open secret, a little boat, so-called research vessel, with 800 chefs on it. Right? Seriously,
The best of the
Seriously.
Norwegian Navy, the chefs. They're very dangerous.
seriously,
with a knife.
and you get a new one, and you get this nice non-suspicious a couple of radar dishes, big ones, the snowball combs, right? The
just
big
cook
ones.
stuff and it's fine.
Yeah, and you've got a new one, spanking new one with much more equipment, much more, or we can find shit, and we can look at the Russians even more because that's why it exists. But now, instead of 800 chefs, it's got 1,000 or something. It's everything's great. But in regards to the Arctic Ocean, that's a very interesting thing because the Russians are anticipating the thawing of the Arctic Strait for their future shipping lines. They are waiting to make a
Ooh.
killing in trade
Very,
above their country.
very, very interesting. The Scandinavian governments right now, I think Britain is doing it as well. They are hiring surveying companies to go out there and start doing 3D surveying underneath the ice sheet, and they're looking for certain materials. And I can't tell you what they're looking for, but there's a lot of ships going out in the Arctic Circle right now.
Might be natural gas.
It could be. Could be any number of things, but any final thoughts for anyone here? Anything you guys want to say before we sign out?
Is my mic still fucked?
Oh God, yes,
Yes.
to Gulag with you.
Oh,
To the fucking.
Are you going to have any more of these streams? Mimir?
I mean, I'd like to do it 3 times a week. It just depends on my schedule. So probably
Wow.
Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday would probably be the best time, because you got to kind of like work around other like large streams that are happening within the community. You know, I wouldn't want to host a stream at the exact same time as like Brexit Party or Andy Worski or JF or anyone like those guys, because they draw a lot of viewers away. And in fact, I'd like to be watching their shows as well. So probably be 2:30 p.m., which I think is I'm at -5 GMT for anybody listening. So
East Coast. Yeah.
Moloch apologizes for his communist mic, but I'm still keeping him in the gulag until next time. So, just real quick, Arian says, maybe after The Prince, we should read Frederick the Great's Anti-Machiavelli. I haven't actually looked into that, so I will put that on the tentative list. For anyone who didn't catch it, the 2 books for this month's reading, Machiavelli's The Prince and Huxley's Brave New World. 2 quick books, and there will be 2 discussion videos on that. So thanks for everyone for watching. Any other final thoughts, anyone?
Nope.
I actually own them. This is great.
Yeah, there you go.
I have final thoughts. The
I have
Danes are the
opinion.
Jews of Northern Europe.
Correct. I totally agree.
I disagree.
That's a bit harsh, don't you think? I mean, don't you feel
Here
sorry
we
for
go.
them?
The Scandinavians
They
can't
have-
stop fighting for 2 seconds.
They have nothing in their country. It's flat as a pancake, and they sound like
Oh,
they're
God.
retards.
I mean,
I would say-
maybe they should take out the 2 potatoes in their throats and speak like a normal person.
See,
And
but
people
also
think
they-
a union will work.
are there any Danes here to defend themselves? This is a bit unfair.
Yeah, I would actually say the same, exact same. So
If there are any Danes
not
watching or
dying.
on the server, let's do a Scandinavian live stream where you guys can just fight each other. Let's do that. All right. Anyway, thanks everyone for watching. Talk to you later.